So let's talk about the Iliad. The first thing I want to say, going into the Iliad, I know a lot of people, they think of the Iliad, they think probably of Achilles. They might think of Achilles and Patroclus. You might think of the book Song of Achilles. If you are a big fan of Song of Achilles, I don't judge you. You can absolutely be a fan. There's parts of that book that I actually really like. Wipe it from your mind, though. That is not the Iliad. Those characters are not the characters you're going to meet in this poem. They are not the actual mythological characters. Wipe them from your mind. That's one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give right now, because just wipe it from your mind. It's really not a great reflection of those particular heroes. Unlearn what you have learned, yes, as Yoda said. Okay, so let us begin. So then what is the Iliad? How accurate is the Troy movie? Don't even get me started. The Iliad is one of the oldest extant works still read to this day by modern audiences. It's one of two epic poems attributed to the prehistoric poet known as Homer. So when we say prehistoric, it means the ancient Greeks. And when we talk about the ancient Greeks, we usually mean from the Archaic Age onward. So roughly like 800-ish BCE onward. They looked at this period, the heroic age, they would have called it, what we would call the Bronze Age of Greece. They considered it prehistory, because remember, there's a whole chunk of centuries in between the ending of the Bronze Age and the starting of the Archaic Age that is called the Greek Dark Ages. It seems to be just a period of relative ignorance and like total illiteracy. It is the Greeks just seem to have forgotten a whole lot of shit in that period. So they look at the Age of Heroes, what we call the Bronze Age, as prehistory. And they look at Homer as a guy who like is just on the cusp of that. So they considered him prehistoric because he would have been born potentially in that dark age. Now, also important to remember, Greece as a nation does not exist. At the time of the ancient Greeks, the way we're talking about them, you're talking about a whole bunch of different city-states. A polis, as it gets called, who are all vibing with each other. And vibing and fighting, really. They're barely vibing with each other. So there's very few things that are considered universal for the ancient Greeks other than their language. Hellenes, they call themselves the Greek-speaking people. They recognize they all speak the same language with, lots of differences. What are the theories on what happened in those dark ages? Not many, actually. It is almost like a black hole of information when it comes to Greece. Because there's just so few artifacts from the period. There is just this big gap. I mean, there seems to have been obviously some sort of decline of the Bronze Age civilizations that kind of collapsed. I mean, anarchy in the UK, I don't know. Like, I don't know enough, and what little I've seen is just very little information. Hence, that when we truly look at it and go, what the fuck even happened? So the ancient Greeks recognized they shared a language, they shared a pantheon of gods. They would say they shared a loose culture. They were constantly battling as to what that culture exactly would be. Hence, the city-states are all different and arguing with each other. However, Homer was special to them. These works were Odyssey and Iliad, the works of Homer, were very special to the ancient Greeks. They saw it as an interpolitical, or you could call universal, pan-Hellenic perspective on the Greeks, because his works are not specific to any one city-state, any one polis. So every polis could embrace Homer and just be like, yeah, this is our, like, this is the core of our culture. In fact, the historian Herodotus said the core of the ancient Greek culture was Homer and Hesiod. So the Iliad, specifically, is what ultimately, for a lot of literature, now volcanic eruption is theorized to have contributed to the collapse. Volcanic eruptions happened all throughout the Bronze Age, including, you've seen the massive one that happened that supposedly, took out, was that Sardinia? No, it was whatever I talked about in Shades, I think. Lots of volcanic eruptions. It wasn't like one big volcanic eruption that likely did it. Like, Mount Terra blew its top dramatically. There were tons of volcanic eruptions, earthquakes. Natural disasters were pretty common. So the Iliad sets the standard for what many people think of when they define the word epic. Gregory Nadja, friend of the show as we call him, who's the classics professor at Harvard, defines epic as an expansive poem of enormous scope composed in an old-fashioned and superbly elevated style of language concerning the wondrous deeds of heroes. Santorini, that's the word I was looking for. I'm like, it's not Sardinia, it's the other one that's essay. Yeah, Terra and Santorini is pretty well prior to the collapse of the Bronze Age. So this is how important the Iliad is in that way. So the Iliad, basic housekeeping, we'll say stats on the Iliad. The original Greek is 15,693 lines in a meter called dactylic hexameter. It's sometimes even called Homeric hexameter. And if you're curious as to how that compares to the Odyssey is only 12,000 something lines. So the Iliad is about 3,000 lines longer. Yeah. They're both, so if the dactylic hexameter is a combination of long and short vowels in a hex, coming from 6-beat line. Now, here's the thing. Dactylic hexameter really only works in Greek. It also works in Latin. It does not work in English. You will never find a version of the Iliad or the Odyssey in English that is in dactylic hexameter because it's simply, English just can't do it. If you want to find an English translation that is close to the idea of dactylic hexameter, I turn you to the work of Richmond Lattimore. His two translations of the epics are done in a loose 6-beat line, which tries to mimic a bit of the feel of hexameter, but it's not a perfect one-to-one. You'll never get it. English just can't do Homeric hexameter. It is believed the Iliad was composed in probably the late 8th century, early 7th century BCE, so very early Archaic Age, in a language that is known as Homeric Greek. And Homeric Greek is a dialect of what's called Ionian Greek, which itself is a dialect of ancient Greek, dialect of a dialect. But one thing is very certain, which is that Homeric Greek specifically, the dialect that is used for these works attributed to Homer, it's not a language that anyone ever spoke. It's a poetic language. It's an artificial language that was really only going to be used by bards, potentially priests, and others. You're not going to go around speaking Homeric Greek. You would speak Ionian Greek. Homeric Greek is very specific for these poems and potentially other ceremonial aspects, we think. We also know that what we think is the most likely, and again, we being kind of a lot of historians and the like, in terms of the likely date for the composition of the Iliad, at least in the form that we have it now, there's a kind of 50-year span between 725 and 765 BCE. And that's actually the same period where we can date some of the earliest examples of Greek alphabetic writing. Keep in mind, prior to this in the Bronze Age, they were not writing in the ancient Greek alphabet. They were using what was known as Linear A and Linear B, which, is it Linear A we've translated? No, we've translated some of Linear B, I think, and Linear A we have no idea. It's one of the two. I always flip A and B. But we start seeing the earliest examples of the Greek alphabet, the way that we think of it now, in that kind of 50-year period, and we think that's right about the time that you start getting not only this written down, but it's reached a point where it's becoming consistent in its composition. Linear B is the one we haven't translated, which makes finding words on a dictionary for translation sometimes easier, sometimes a nightmare. Exactly. The Iliad is divided into, rather like the Odyssey, into 24 books. Sometimes scholars will call them scrolls. We don't know if that division happened later or how late it even happened. There's a lot of question marks. When you're going this far back in history, there's a lot of question marks and a lot of us saying we're not entirely sure, which does mean there's a lot of speculation, a lot of argument. Which then, speaking of arguments, let's come to the big question, the big one. Was Homer a real guy? Oh boy, that's sure a question. It's an excellent question. You could argue it's one of the biggest questions in classical scholarship, whether it, oh my god, it's literally called the Homeric question. There are books written on this topic. So, I'm not going to go too deep into it. I'm going to go real quick over basically the stances that people have on the Homeric question of was Homer real? For the longest time, there were two major schools of thought when it came to the authorship of the Homeric epics, to the Homeric question, which was you had the Unitarians and the Analysts. The Unitarians, they argue that the Iliad and the Odyssey are two poems that are the creation of a single poetic genius named Homer. The ancient Greeks believed he was, what little they thought of him, they were pretty certain he was blind, apparently. Not sure where that came from, but what I'd call the Homer paradox, yes. And that he was in the Archaic Age, and that's it. Then you get the Analysts. The Analysts say, you're bloody fucking morons. The poems contain too many discrepancies. There's a lack of unity, reflecting the joining together of a whole bunch of different poems by a whole bunch of different authors. Basically, somebody found a bunch of different poems from other people and slapdashed them together. Those were the two main rounds of thought until you get to finally the 20th century. Yes, Bernard Knox spends a lot of time talking about this. When you get into the 20th century, a third route of thinking starts to kind of push its way in there as an almost sort of middle road splitting of the difference. And that is the oral formulaic composition kind of theory, which basically says the poems that we have now are the result of generations of oral composition and transmission with additions, deletions, modifications appearing in every retelling, until essentially you get to a point where it has been retold and recited so much it reaches a sense of consistency. This is all about oral composition and about how the ancient Greece was a song culture. It was a very oral driven culture. So it kind of, it doesn't really seek to answer the Homeric question. It kind of fits in an interesting sort of down the middle, split the difference way. But basically I can tell you, everyone still argues about it. I mean, even to this day. Blindness is part of the archetype of the ancient poet, inspired from, gods and prophets, explanation of oral tradition only. Exactly, absolutely. So that's your brief overview of the Homeric question. In general, most people by this point believe Homer was not a real guy. I can tell you why, to me, I think the idea that the Greeks would latch on to this character of Homer makes sense to me, and that has to do with their love of the idea of the super excellent individual. And this will tie into the Greek hero and everything else. Like, it makes complete sense to me that they would have this idea that one guy wrote both, composed both of these works. For the ancient Greeks, to me, it makes so much sense. By now, however, we look at it and go, probably not, but because they are such an oral culture, at some point the poems reached a level of consistency where they got written down because it was being told the same way enough. There you go, at this point you've now reached it, right? Which of the three do I believe? I'm kind of in the third route. I don't think Homer was a real guy. I think there's a point where you start telling a story enough that it reaches, again, relative consistency. I would love to believe. I mean, if it turns out we get proof that Homer was a real guy, I'll be like, damn, okay. I will say that throughout book club and throughout this, I'm going to refer to the idea of Homer and of there being an author, if for nothing else than ease. It's just easy to say we're talking about Homer and what he is saying because we have this figure. So to me, the figure of Homer is like an easy stand-in for however this was composed. So, the Iliad, alongside Odyssey, earned a canonical place in the institutions of the various city-states, but we know especially in ancient Athens by at least the 6th century, so we're pretty firmly in, I believe, we're in the classical period, in that a lot of big religious festivals featured performances of the Homeric epics. In fact, I believe it's one of the biggest religious festivals in ancient Athens, had whole sections devoted two like almost contests of recitations of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Again, Herodotus, that great ancient Greek historian, was like, it's part Homer, Hesiod, foundations of Greek culture, and every polis would have agreed. Every city-state would have agreed. Again, he was unique in providing an air quotes pan-Hellenic perspective. So these myths, as we call them, hold an interesting space because of how the religion of ancient Greece was interwoven into nearly every aspect of these people's lives. Again, quoting my man, friend of the show, is my favorite way of this. When we apply the term religion to such traditional practices as the worship of gods in the classical period of Greek civilization, as also in earlier periods, we need to think of such practices in terms of an interaction between myth and ritual. And he gives quick working definitions of myth and ritual. Ritual is doing and saying things in such a way that is considered sacred. Myth is saying things in a way that is also considered sacred. So ritual frames myth. These were sacred texts. It's why, as gory as they may get at times, there are some things they will never go. They will only go so far in some respects because, again, these are sacred texts in their way. Very hard to think of this, I know, for people when we're talking about a non-unified religion and a very localized one, but there you go. At the end of the day, the Iliad and also the Odyssey, of course, are part of a long tradition of oral storytelling, and most people who would have consumed the Iliad and the Odyssey would have done so orally. They would have heard it. They would have listened to it. As an audience member, they likely would have heard it from either what is known as Aoidos, and that's a Greek singer or oral like epic poet, or they might have heard it from a Rhapsodies. Who is a professional performer of epic poetry, almost very particularly on the works of Homer. And that's just because of, basic simple answer, widespread illiteracy. Most people were not literate, so you would hear it. Again, also we will tie into the ancient Greeks as a song culture. There was sometimes it believed that there might have been some sort of musical accompaniment to this, and because of the way the dactylic hexameter is performed, it is almost lilting in a kind of song-like way. So, Iliad, in the same way that the Odyssey means a story of Odysseus, the Iliad is a word that means a poem about Ilion. A poem about Troy, a story of Troy. Yes, make the Troy story joke. I know everybody wants to make it. It's real easy. And that is, we know that it may not have initially had that title. We know it was called the Iliad from at least like the 5th century BCE because that's what Herodotus called it. We don't even know who gave it that title. But we know at least by the 5th century BCE, Herodotus is referring to it as the Iliad. So at some point it got that title, likely the same thing with the Odyssey. You got a friend in me, ba-dee-nee-nee. Ultimately, the Iliad is going to show us the tragic course of the rage of Achilles, or Achilles, as I'm going to call him in this out of habit. When we get to book 1, you'll know why I call him that. It's the same thing. Tomato, tomato. I'm being a little more transliterate than anything else. And his final recognition of human values. It's one of the guiding themes and arc trajectory of the poem. It's developed against a background of violence and death. We're going to see a grim progress of war that's interrupted by scenes which are meant to remind the audience that the brutality of war is integral to human life, but not the whole of it. Again, this was a very, very violent, unstable world. And even going into the later periods. So war was common. They're recognizing that's just a part of life. It's not all of it, but it's a big part of it. We're going to see, especially when we get into the moments that involve talking about the killing and about the combat, and there's going to be a lot of it. What Homer does is intersperse and do comparisons of these relentless and very gruesome deaths. He will contrast it with these vivid pictures of normalcy, of normal life. And that's what brings kind of all of these tragic, heroic values of the warriors and into contrast with the creative values of civilized life that's going to be destroyed because of war. Essentially, we're looking at the two poles of human existence here. war, and peace, and the different aspects of human nature that go with that, what we call the destructive and the creative. It's going to infuse nearly every situation, every statement in this story from the very beginning. I'm going to quote Bernard Knox here because I loved the way he said this. He says, "The Iliad is a terrifying poem." Terrifying. And it remains not only one of the greatest epic poems in literature, I mean, certainly in Western literature, but it's also one of its most tragic. Because at the end of the day, you're gonna be left with kind of just a sense of waste. You're just gonna see a whole lot of loss, and it's not gonna feel very triumphant. Contrasted with, say, the Odyssey, which ends very triumphantly. This is gonna end in, you're just gonna feel pretty sad. I'm gonna be real. This is a tragedy in every sense of the word. So, and I mean, we end with lamentations at a funeral. So we are left understanding it's a sad thing. So, all right, let's talk about the Iliad as history, the historicity. I love that word, but it does kind of make me laugh. It sounds like it should be a fake word. Historicity. Yeah, we want a good sad book, okay? I mean, you'll have moments of petty. Don't get me wrong. All these people be fucking petty. But it is, at the end of the day, a sad story. It's a story of war. It's not really going to be happy. Would you say that despite the fact the Greeks won in the end, they still lost far more than they ever gained, whatever that was? Yeah, I think that argument is absolutely there. Even more so when you bring it together with the Odyssey. There's a fantastic set of books. One is called Achilles in Vietnam, and the other is called like Odysseus in, it's some American city, like, or American state. I call it like Odysseus on the home front, where it literally uses these two epics and explores what happens to a person who goes through war and what happens after. These are two arguably, I think, reasonably at times anti-war works. And we'll get into that in a bit. Catharsis for the class. Will this be cathartic for us? I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, the anti-war stories. There's a lot. No, the Greeks won. The Greeks won. Don't get it wrong. Yes, the PTSD is strong. But yeah, there's the UK's attitude to World War I. Yeah. Or even arguably to World War II. Yeah, absolutely. In the Odyssey, no one of the Greek brings home spoils, if not after the biggest turmoils. Well, except for Menelaus. Menelaus does. Although he gets even more but even then, he is still pretty wrecked by the war. I mean, we see again in Odyssey the effect the war had on everybody who survived it. They survive. It's fascinating. So, the Iliad is history. For the ancient Greeks, the archaic, the classical, the post-classical, the Greeks in the Roman Empire, the Iliad was history. Look, the Greek historian Thucydides, who is arguably the most critical and skeptical of the ancient Greek historians when it comes to these stories of the past, like prehistoric, heroic ages, like he's pretty skeptical of all of it. He's one of the most skeptical. Even he accepted the idea that there was this pan-Hellenic, pan-Achaean, we'll say, expedition against Troy, and he took it as historical fact. Now, he thought Homer exaggerated it a bit, but he was like, no, it totally happened. Even Thucydides. That's true, yeah, he's stuck in Egypt, loses his brother most of the time, friendship with Odysseus. So even our Ginger King is not unscathed. It's true. He's not unscathed, but he does bring back war booty. He's one of the few. Well, I mean, and again, technically Agamemnon did, but then he died right after. Anywho, sorry, let's not get distracted. But yeah, so the ancient Greeks. Oh, we're gonna talk about Schliemann. We're gonna talk about Schliemann. He's coming. Don't you worry, we're about to talk about Schliemann. He's coming up, fear not. Homer's war, as we call it, the war at Troy, and its historicity, God, that word cracks me up. I'm sorry, I'm gonna keep saying that word, it makes me laugh. Was genuinely, not seriously questioned in any real way until like the 19th century. So like until the 1800s, people legitimately just kind of took it and were like, yeah, it totally happened. Then you get to the 19th century and people go, you know, maybe this like wasn't real. Maybe, like, we shouldn't just be looking at this as fact as opposed to truth. Thank you, Indiana Jones. Because for the long, people finally started to realize that the poem itself, the Iliad itself, was the only actual evidence they had, the idea that this even happened, number one. And then when we get to Schliemann, Howard Schliemann, this guy was obsessed with proving the Trojan War was real. Real obsessed. So he went looking and he went digging. And by digging, yeah, he digged. He also dynamited a shitload of it. You say Schliemann, and every historian, archaeologist, and classicist wants to scream inside. Because he destroyed about as much as he found, because again, he was using goddamn dynamite to find this shit. And he just destroyed about as much as he found. Now, he claimed he was in modern day Turkey at a place called Historicity. He claimed this was the mythological city of Troy, and he found multiple layers to this site when he started digging, which is not that unusual, even when you date back to the Bronze Age. Again, we know for a fact that the palace at Minos on Crete has multiple versions because, hey, yeah, they underwent earthquakes, Mount Terra blew its top, like stuff would happen that would cause destruction, and also just over time, you rebuild, get better tools, get everything. So he found a particular layer at Historicity, what he's claiming is Troy, that seemed to be fire blackened, had evidence of fire damage. He said, see, look at this. Proof! It's a clue. It's a clue. He found a clue. He's like, this is it. This is Troy. This is proof. Proof. All of those ships we talk about in the catalog of ships, they were all here. It's a clue. Now, here's the thing. We have no evidence that fire damage is because of the war at Troy. This could be a fire of London situation, could have been an accident, could have been the result of a natural disaster, which caused a fire. There is no proof that the fire-blackened layer at Historicity that Schliemann discovered by blowing shit up is in any way because the Trojan War, as dictated to us in the Iliad, is in any way true. Any historian or classicist or archaeologist will tell you, no, it did not happen. No. In fact, what evidence we have, and for this I turn you, there's a good little section in which I think, Mariana, you mentioned earlier, in this book called 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed by Eric Klein, which is talking about the collapse of the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean, like nursery as we call it, that area. So those civilizations, Egypt, Anatolia, Asia Minor, and also then Greece. There is evidence that it seems like Mycenaean Greeks were over in Asia Minor, potentially helping some places rebel against the Hittites. Ironically, we also think it's the Hittites who brought the idea of like a lot of chariots and chariot warfare to the Greeks. Anyway, but even then, most historians go, we actually don't think that is in any way what the Trojan War was referencing. We actually think that's related to Heracles' expeditions out where he has some shenanigans out in Troy prior to the Trojan War, and we think that's actually maybe where they pulled that idea from. But a lot of this is very, in that way up in the air. But also, yeah, maybe it had fire damage because he blew it up. He had a habit of doing that. He's also the one who very famously found the artifact that's known as the mask or the death mask of Agamemnon, except we have dated it and went, no. It doesn't match. It doesn't match the period. So I'll say this, as I have in my footnote here. Schliemann's excavations at what he called Troy and Mycenae, he very famously did go dig at Mycenae. Hey, at least he's in the right place, but kind of hard to fuck that one up. As well as other sites mentioned in Homer, revealed a previously unsuspected Bronze Age civilization. Like, a lot of this stuff just hadn't, frankly, been discovered yet. Its including weaponry and a lot of particular objects. Like, he claimed he found a cup that seemed to correspond to descriptions Homer did of Nestor's cup. And they were like, found it! This is Nestor's cup! And it's like, or it's a cup of the bronze. Buddy. He went in with the theory and went in to prove his theory. He didn't mold the evidence. He didn't use the evidence to make a theory. He did the theory and made the evidence fit it. Except, of course, its approximate date, which we can determine again by archaeological evidence, seems to coincide with the date, and a lot of these dates don't match. Nothing is really dated at the correct period. that people say if there was something like an incident that involved that, could have inspired these myths of the Trojan War, we have a kind of rough period we put them in. None of the shit he found at like Mycenae and everywhere else fits that period at all. He's way off, like by centuries, basically. So most of us all look at Schliemann, and if we could go back in time and punch him, we would. Especially for the fact that he, again, was blowing shit up. Like, confirmation bias, right? The guy was convinced Troy was real because when he was 7, he had a book that on his cover. Yeah, exactly. And there must have been a reference for that drawing to exist. Exactly. Like, Mariana can equally tell you, and anybody who's read anything about Schliemann can tell you how much, like, again, historians, classicists, and archaeologists all have beef with this man. Everyone's got beef with this man. Now, so the ancient Greeks believed. So back to what the ancient Greeks believed. Remember, the ancient Greeks are taking this all as historical fact. Ironically, note, we know more about the Bronze Age Greeks than the actual ancient Greeks did. We're further away and we know more than they did. So that tells you, again, how much just kind of got, lost, for lack of a better word. The ancient Greeks believed that the Iliad was supposed to have preserved the memory of these particular events over the course of, again, some 5 to 6 seemingly completely illiterate centuries, with obviously no errors. Yay. As Bernard Knox again notes in his thing, because remember, as we're going to talk about in the invocation of the Muses, in book 1. The idea is that the poet is hearing this from the muse, because the epic muse, however, is not the muse of history. Her vision of past events should always be suspect. But the idea is none of us should ever in the modern day, should take this as history. But the ancient Greeks did. But Vilusa? I don't know what Vilusa is. The most common location most people go, unless that's also the name for Historic. I only know the name Historic. Somebody can look at that for me. And again, though we in the modern day have our doubts and our skepticism about all of this, the Greeks of ancient times did not. For them, history, as they understood it, began with an incredible pan-Hellenic, pan-Achaean expedition against an Eastern foreign foe, which was led by kings and included contingents from all of the more and I'm not even kidding, 150 places that are going to be listed in book 2 in the catalog of ships. It's going to be the Great Listicle. Everybody's going to die. It's where most people, when they go into the Iliad with no background, if they make it through book 1, which can be difficult for a lot of people, book 2 is where they die, because that's the catalog of ships. Kale, Turkey. Can some Hittite name of Troy? That might be the Hittite name of Troy. We think. Again, there's a big we think. Because a lot of these Bronze Age civilizations had different names for each other. Hell, we don't even know what the Minoans called themselves. We call them the Minoans. But that was a name given to them in the 18th, 19th century, when people started discovering the evidence of the Bronze Age civilization. Same with the Mycenaeans. They didn't call themselves that. All of these, whether it be the Hittites, the Egyptians, everybody else, had different names for people. If I had my ADHD's worst nightmare, it is truly a pain. Vilusa. Hold on a second, actually. I'm so sorry, Peg. I got up. I'm right back. He said Vilusa, and I did take some notes from 1177 BCE where he mentions all the different names for things, and I want to see if I wrote it down. Because if I did, then I can maybe... Yes, that was one of... We think is if that was Troy. If that's what that city was, we do believe that was one of the names. I didn't write down specifically what it was. It might be the Hittite one. But yes, in the book 1177 BCE, Ernest Klein. Yes. These old ancient names. We think. Again, there's a lot of we think. We think. So understand that for the ancient Greeks, this was history. For us in the modern day, no, it's not. None of these people were real. We'll even trust me, when we get into book 1 and we talk about names and naming, which anybody who came to Odyssey Book Club knows, we talked a lot about that. We're going to talk a little bit about the whole chicken and the egg argument involving names and naming. If I recall correctly, the philological proof of Vilusa being Troy is because it was Vilusa at the same PI Ebro as Elos. Huh. Interesting. Can't remember. I'll have to look at that again. So, let's talk about, well, war and warfare. You're gonna get a lot of it. This is a war story, if nothing else. As Bernard Knox says, so as if we believe this, they're saying this is the beginning of like their history as Greeks. History thus began with an appropriate beginning, a war. Okay. Because understand that for the ancient Greeks and these city-states, from their very beginnings, and like until they're at a loss of political independence, so you're like even by the time, so from their early beginnings to basically when they were conquered by Rome, because at that point they lose. We back? And so it begins. No, it's not you. It might be mine. We good? It fixed? Okay. No, it's me. I saw the connection issue up on my phone. Okay, we're back. Good. So I was saying, the Greek on something about Rome. Oh, wow. Okay, way behind. That basically these city-states, from their beginnings, until they lose their political independence, so they are conquered by Rome eventually, they're pretty much in an uninterrupted series of conflicts and wars with each other. Not even just with foreign powers, with each other. So the idea is that understanding the Greek polis, the Greek city-state, was a community that was surrounded by enemies. Again, these city-states saw themselves as countries unto themselves. And these people who surrounded you could turn into legitimate belligerents, basically actual war-related enemies, at the first sign of either aggression or weakness. Everybody was kind of basically on a knife's edge with everyone else. So the permanence of war, the constant nature of war, is consistent in Greek literature. I mean, from Homer, who's kind of the earliest writings, going to even like the classical and post-classical, looking at like Plato and others. And even Plato in his work, Laws, says that peace is just a name. The truth is that every city-state is by natural law engaged in a perpetual, undeclared war with every other city-state. So again, war was a constant, and the threat of war and of conflict was a constant in these people's lives. So then let's look at the war we get from Homer, basically. The fighting that Homer describes is clearly a creation suited for poetry, as opposed to any sort of representation of actual battle conditions, right? For example, we know that the Mycenaeans had a bunch of chariots. The Mycenaeans, aka these mainland Bronze Age Greeks, they had a shit ton of chariots. We know they had chariots. We know chariot warfare was huge in the Bronze Age. It was kind of the Bronze Age was the heyday of the chariot and its use in warfare. But you're going to see chariots in the Iliad used so that essentially kings will come on out in their chariots in front of the infantry, hop on out, give a speech, and then engage in a one-on-one duel. That's not how the warfare would have actually gone in the Bronze Age, right? This was expensive equipment, not only to have, but to transport and everything else, especially when it comes to the topography of Greece. Is that war then related to the raiding culture? Is that more separate? A little bit of both. A little bit of both. Raids weren't necessarily meaning war. So a little bit of both. So the likelihood of that's what chariot warfare that we see in the Iliad is used for is, it's a poetic license. It fits the poetry. It's not meant to be an accurate representation of combat in like the techniques and everything else in that way. Because we know for the centuries really after the Bronze Age, where we're still a little in the dark on a lot of their battle techniques, if you will, we know that Greek battles were fought by armored infantry at very close quarters. We know that archers were rare. Cavalry was pretty much non-existent. Like, you didn't have a cavalry unit you would send in to fight. Again, if they had chariots, your horsemen might only be used in pursuit after the enemy had broken and was fleeing. Also the idea that you would have had hand-to-hand combatants. Like, in the Iliad, these people, again, are going to hop down and make grand speeches. Look, we know that while these guys might have shouted at each other in the heat of combat, they're not going to sit there and deliver an entire oration. Again, this is poetry, right? Yeah, this is a bit of, like, poetic license. Yeah, there's a lot of raiding stuff covered in the Kypria, because it's the prelude to the Iliad, really. We know, and let's also keep in mind, nobody had standing armies. These were all what we would call citizen soldiers. Basically, they'd say, hey, we're going to fight. We'll promise you some loot. You in? Sure. You showed up with your kit. That was your personal kit. This is not the Roman military, which, which standardized it, and also you had a standing army when it comes to, like, say, ancient Rome. These guys did not have standing armies. None of these guys were soldiers by profession, if you will. But I will say that all of these citizen soldiers, if you're an ancient Greek man, you've probably been in combat of some kind. If you're listening to Homer, you're recognizing this is poetic license, but what you would recognize very vividly is how Homer describes what metal will do to flesh. Because while one of these citizen soldiers may not have, fought an epic, one-on-one, mano-a-mano duel, he exchanged spear thrusts in a phalanx. Phalanx being the main formation they would use, usually had an overlapping shield. And that's, again, the disciplined line of overlapping shield is what's known as the phalanx. And so these men who had been in something like that would absolutely recognize, yeah, that's what happens when what metal does to flesh in violent situations like this. So a soldier, while going, there's poetic license, would absolutely go, but that's right. And look, let me tell you, Homer's not going to gloss over in any way the brutality and the harsh reality of what gets called often the work of killing, and doesn't sentimentalize the pain that's felt, nor does he, nor even the degradation of violent death. To quote, again, Bernard Knox, who I thought just said this beautifully, men are going to die in the Iliad in agony. They will drop screaming to their knees, reaching out to beloved companions, gasping their lives out, clawing the ground with their hands. They will die roaring, raging, bellowing, and moaning. Again, Homer is going to show you what I started calling it like the psychosis of warfare. He's going to show you the ugly bits, and he's not going to shy away from it, because it's important. There's also important to know that for these people who are going to war, like your threat of death is the end. There's no you'll ascend to heaven. There's nothing comforting about what comes after death. For those whose life is going to be taken, and violently in this story, the people involved in the story and the poem itself, and this reflects the ancient Greek culture, are really much more consumed with and more obsessed with the physical destruction of body, followed by the extinction of life within it. Like, the idea of what happens to the soul, kind of not important to them. The body becomes the obsession. And the proper disposal of it. In fact, we're going to see a lot of the champions and the people who fall, even in the Trojan War, it's because they're fighting to gain control of some of the corpse of either a very prominent foe, because you want to loot it. Look, this is going to be very normal. Again, start getting cool with stuff real quick. Or to save the corpse of a friend from the enemy. You didn't want to leave them behind. Stripping of the dead of their stuff is very common. In fact, heroes will do it even to their friends. Maybe not as much to their friends, but definitely their foes. You will strip the foe of their armor. Hey, that could be good shit. And it's not just the Greeks who do this, the Trojans do it too. Understand, this is equal. This is happening on both sides. The stripping of the dead, it was common. It was not considered like such a bad thing. It was normal. So long as you didn't fuck with the body. Taking the stuff off of it, that's whatever, go ahead and do that. But don't fuck with the body at that point. It's about the proper, disposal of it. And the proper disposal of the body also is going to come to, we're going to hear descriptions that Homer's not under any illusions what happens to a body after it dies. Like, these people, part of this is understood that your body, once you're dead, the life is gone from the body. If you do not rescue it for burning and then burial of those ashes, the elements will take it. Nature and the elements. Oh, okay, we're back. Tell me when we're back. Yeah, I know. I should be back. Okay, we're back. Okay, good. Part of the point of looting the body in that era was part of how you get profit. Absolutely. That's war prizes. You can take that. But also, and we'll get even more to that. I know the look of disappointment. Because I can see it happen on my things, so I know when it happens, and I just have to wait for it to come back. She has risen, baby girl. No, most of this time it's me. So yeah, we are obsessed with, what was the last thing we recall me saying, so I know where I got cut off. Can someone say what they recall, some form of bragging rights? So we were talking only about looting of the body. Did I get into the elements due to bodies being taken by the elements? Thank you, Mariana. So, Homer, rot and decay. They are very aware that the elements that carrion animals, whether it be birds, dogs, I mean, if you're in the water, eels and fish, like, you'll get consumed. Your body will get ruined. And they don't want that to happen. So unless you are protected by divine interference, your wounds are going to become hosts for worms and flies and all the gross things. Basically, all the things with death. They have no illusions about the grossness, if you will, of death. Oh yeah, don't worry, we'll talk about it. Don't worry, we'll talk about Achilles. We'll talk about Achilles. We think of, when I used this phrase earlier, I called it the psychosis of war, or warfare. And there's a quote that was used by Bernard Knox, by General Lee, where he says, "It is all well that war is so terrible, or we should grow too fond of it." So as I say, the Iliad is a poem about the kind of like collective psychosis of warfare, and it will simultaneously celebrate the heroic values that the war imposes upon the people who are within it, as well as exposing, again, that collective psychosis. Because there is, let's be honest, as there's a kind of, rather deadly fascination of it, especially for those who grow up in its service. For a lot of these warriors, where war and conflict would have been a very normal thing, there is absolutely a deadly fascination with it. We're gonna see these warriors, they're gonna, yell against their condition. They're like, terrible war, it's so awful. But at the same time, they will enjoy the more intoxicating excitements and elements of war, the rush of adrenaline and of winning, as we say. They will revel in the exultation of victory as they taunt a fallen adversary with threats of exposure of his corpse, or they will mock their victims. For someone who asked about Patroclus, he's also an asshole. By the way, that's something Patroclus will do. We're gonna watch him do it in the Iliad. And even Hector takes with pride and joy, the proof that he's a seasoned fighter, that he has won battles. These people, they are celebrating the fact that they are killing other people. And you will absolutely see every single person revel in that, even while they're also saying war is terrible. What wild. Yeah, again, for anybody who only thinks of Patroclus from Song of Achilles, welcome to the Rude Awakening. You're going to meet the actual Patroclus, not sad boy twink nonsense. So meet the real Patroclus. He was a fighter and a warrior and a part of this culture. Absolutely. The Iliad exists. It moves and breathes and everything. Its being is in war. And this is it's a world we're going to see of organized violence, and a man where these men are going to justify their very existence most clearly in the killing of others, especially Achilles when we get to that. So we will again see this dichotomy. War is going to be dreadful. Not a medic? No, he's not a medic. Again, I can't even talk. War is going to be dreadful, or as they'll call it, man-killing, hateful, but it's also going to be described as bringing glory to man. It's a thing that will make people eager, even yearning for the battle it will bring. Again, both of these things will be true at once, right? It is a brutal, necessary part of life. There is an adrenaline rush. There are people who your blood gets up, and when you're in it, you're in it. But at the same time, you can go, and it's terrible. War is hell, kind of thing. Yeah, everybody is garbage, and everybody is basically would be a war criminal, if that were a thing. I mean, the closest anybody gets to a ancient war criminal is Achilles, but we're not there yet. Everyone's a mess. Yeah, everyone's going to be terrible. Homer, again, is very descriptive. His passages are said to have an almost hallucinatory power. And it's mostly because of the way and again, I'm saying so however, the way the Iliad is composed, it is very deliberate, it is very precise, and you will have a combination of the reason it works is because he'll describe to you how the person doing the killing gives that final blow, and the almost terror-struck passivity of the person being killed. And usually, though not always, you will see the victor's joy of battle and the very hideous suffering of the victim will usually end up evenly balanced. Again, he's showing you both. He will, and as I mentioned, the way that he paints these vivid portraits of everyday life alongside absolute brutality comes in these moments of killing, where he's going to basically contrast the grotesqueness of a violent death with a very familiar description. For example, I think there's one dude who's going to get like a spear up through a certain area, and he'll compare it to a fish, the fisherman who's taking delight in the fish that's gaping on his hook, kind of thing. But it is important to note that we are almost always shown this action from the killer's point of view. We will have the excitement of the hunter catching his prey, again, the joy of the fisherman hauling in his catch. He's going to be pretty fucking realistic for a guy who's writing poetry. Again, the citizen soldier of ancient Greece is going to be like, yeah, that's what metal does to flesh. That's the insanity of what we go. They would recognize that. And so again, in a lot of cases of both things can be true, it's the combination of two contrary emotions. Our initial and instinctive revulsion to bloodshed. I mean, it's gross, let's be real. But the susceptibility to the excitements of violence. Think modern day, you go watch an action movie. You get hyped, violent as hell, but there's an excitement that gets to you. Homer taps into that, and he's exposing that this is what warfare does. Both things are true. And somebody mentioned World War I back in there, and I love that somebody mentioned that, because what the Iliad shows us is not only, again, that ugly brutality, but a kind of, and I will say, quote, terrible beauty that war has. And that, quote, terrible beauty is something that Yeats used when writing his poetry about World War I. Which look at Troy like the war at Troy, like World War I. It was literally the war to end all wars for the ancient Greeks. This was the war that basically brought down eventually the Age of Heroes. It was something that wiped out basically nearly an entire generation. So it's good to think of it in that way. It's also a big siege. We'll have to keep that in mind. The Iliad is basically, the war of the Iliad, it accepts without sentimentality that violence is a permanent factor in human life. And that is because it's just as sentimental to pretend that war does not have its monstrous ugliness as it is to also deny that it has that kind of strange and fatal beauty. There is a power to a war and to something like this that calls out in men a kind of, and for them men, because women were almost never there, very few exceptions, a kind of resource, a kind of endurance, courage, and a kind of self-sacrifice that peacetime, tragically, to like really our own sorrow and humanity's loss, just can't command because there's no need for it, right? It brings out something exceptional. And as we say, the reason this has lasted for so long, nearly 3,000 years old, that's how old this poem is. The human condition is still not that different. We are still lovers and victims of a will to violence, ultimately, and so long as we are, Homer and the Iliad will be read as its oldest, and as some would say, possibly its truest interpreter. There's a reason this poem has stood the test of time even to this day. Whew. Okay, so war. We know a lot about war. This is the war at Troy. Let's talk about Troy, or Ilion, Ilium. Let's talk about Troy. Because at the end of the day, what is this all about? The Greeks would understand that the reason this is called the Iliad is because in it, though we do not see the entirety of the story of the war at Troy, we are essentially almost presented the whole story, because it was understood by the Greeks when the story ends, which it ends on the funeral of Hector. It was understood that Troy was going to fall not too long after that. They knew that ultimately what this was driving towards is the complete destruction of Troy. The destruction of a city was a calamity to the ancient peoples, and it would be felt all the more deeply because of the fact that these people who lived in these cities and their attachment to their city and their city state had been reinforced over generations, usually from a mythical past that they would tell you. Again, as we joke that Heracles, everybody wanted a piece of that ass. Every polis every city-state tried to claim a connection to Heracles because he was the guy. He's our guy. So everyone's got their own mythic past. And to whether it be its landmarks, its buildings, everything else. So the idea of the fall of a city was, as I said, a calamity. It was a calamitous event to the idea of the ancient Greeks. And the great irony, we talked about the polis, the city-state, these Greek city-states. The first city, the first kind of city-state we hear of in Greek literature, it's not even a Greek city. It's Troy. That's why it was even more so tragic to the people who would listen, because Troy in the Iliad, and for a lot of the ancient Greeks, became this kind of literary prototype of all these future Greek cities, these Greek city-states, the polis, and it's going to be destroyed. It's one of the main tragic forces of the story is that Troy is going to fall, and it's going to go down in flames. I mean, it is doomed to go down in fire and absolute slaughter under the assault of the Achaeans when they eventually get inside. And the thing about the Achaeans, their cities, their city-states are far away. They're kind of half forgotten because they've been at siege for 9 years. It's a long siege. So their entire home at this point has been a world of tent shelters and beach ships, not the cities that they remember. The only city the Greek would recognize listening to the Iliad is that of Troy. Luhine was the Trojan language, right? I don't know. I don't know enough about that. What language? I don't know enough about ancient linguistics to speak on that. So, again, even though Iliad ends before Troy falls, there is no question about Troy's fate. Everybody who would have listened would have understood, and it's foreshadowed so much and understood through the poem that there is no doubt what's going to happen within the next year. Because again, this is year 9 we enter with the Iliad. And look, even though Homer does give Troy a couple traits that make it sound non-Greek and kind of foreign. So like Priam has 50 sons, for example. Like they'd be like, holy shit, what the fuck? And there's a couple other Eastern, air quotes here, Eastern, basically non-Greek elements. It is, for all intents and purposes, a Greek city-state, a Greek polis. And it's a really wealthy one at that. It's important that it's wealthy because it's made very, 50. Oh, dude, he had multiple wives and a whole lot of fucking children, okay? The wealth of Troy is going to be made very clear to us in the poem, because what's going to happen in multiple cases in the Iliad is that when they lose a fight and they're menaced with death, these Trojan warriors of note, and a lot of them might be, we'll say, nobles or royal, are going to offer a really rich ransom for their lives, which anybody who's either a medievalist or has done any medieval studies knows in medieval times, you didn't kill the knights and the lords, you took them hostage and you ransomed them back. You made a shit ton of money that way. You would rather catch someone alive and sell them back than kill them. They're not worth much to you dead. But what's going to be really important to keep in mind is when this happens, there's 3 big cases in the poem where this happens. Every single time, that ransom is going to be refused. Because this is, again, year 9 of the war. This is the war turning into its final and most savage phase. Because in the past 10 years, where this would have been happening for 10 years, 9 years really, the past 9 years, as this was happening, dude, the Achaeans got rich as shit doing this to the Trojans. They made so much money off of ransoming Trojans back, but this is year 9. The Greeks are fucking tired. They're not at home in their beds. They're in tent shelters, in the shadow of their beach ships. They are done. They would rather end it faster than get richer, which tells you how savage they're getting and tells you where we're, like, the tipping point we're reaching in the war. And don't get me wrong, they're going to make appeals to accept a ransom more than once. Like, these people who've been caught are going to try and repeat it. They don't want to die, so they're like, look, just take the money. It's what you've done for the past 9 years, take the money. It's a reminder for us and showing the contrast of Trojan attitudes. As we say, it shows a belief typical of rich, civilized cities and city-states that wealth can always buy a solution. Basically, you can always buy your way out. And it shows an illusion that the civilized ways of warfare, the gentlemanly warfare, if you will, which would involve things like quarter for the disarmed or for surrendering men, ransom, exchange of prisoners, all these things they've probably been doing for 9 years. That to the Trojans, these ideas are laws that are as valid and universal as the laws under which their own civilization continues. Because inside Troy, these manners, this idea of civilization, civilized life, it's preserved. It's still going. People have restraints on their anger. There's courtesy to their opponents, unless you're Paris, but we'll get to that. There's kindness to the weak. These are things that the Greeks have no place for. This is an armed camp on the shore. They are not at home in their civilized beds. There is no room for this for the Greek camp. And it's going to be part of how ultimately also the Trojans will fall. It's just the point where humanity is starting to go out the window for the Greeks. To a degree. There are some things they will still hold dear, but they've been here for 9 years. They're starting, you could say, arguing like, we're forgetting what home looks like. Like, we can't keep, I don't know how, like, yes, I love it, but also I don't know how much more of this I can take. They're starting to, as I say, the psychosis of warfare, they're losing it a little bit. The savagery is getting amped up. We're going into the final phase of, it's like, we're gonna get this shit done now. Enough is enough. And the thing is that, again, these Trojans might seem more civilized, air quotes. These civilized qualities means they are not anywhere nearly at home with the grim business of war as the Greeks are. Because remember, because Troy, let's remember, Troy is not at peace. They are under siege. And they are under siege by men who mean to raze it from the face of the earth. So these arts of peace, as civilized as they are useless here. They mean nothing right now. This is war. It's grim, it's brutal, it's savage. You know, there's no Mr. Nice Guy here. And the fact that Troy is in some ways trying to play at peace, it's like, that's going to cost you. Obviously, it inevitably does. And of course, you know, as we say, there's a inevitability to the fall of Troy, where I'll briefly say from the point of view of the gods, all human struggles, mind you. These deaths of heroes, the fall of cities, for the gods at least, this is just passing interest. I mean, they will be forgotten and replaced by similar events as played out by different actors. I think, like I was saying in when I talked about Shades from Stories from Sticks, same shit, different day. Yes, Troy is massive for the humans. Huge for the humans. I mean, for the gods, it's like, there'll be another war. Humans will try to kill each other again at some point. So Troy is going to fall now, but one day so will the cities of the kingdoms of the Greeks. These great wars that bring glory and death to these heroes are not even going to leave a mark on the landscape, right? Like, the walls will, there will be no evidence of the great walls of Troy. Nothing. You won't even know they were there. Another way of looking at this, so many of these men lost their youth and their prime years waging a war that seems without end. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I would start biting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, what we see here, and with what we see as the looming destruction of Troy, is that man's greatest efforts, your highest efforts, and your struggles on Earth are, we'll say from the point of view of the gods, insignificant. I mean, you'll get something, these huge military constructions, like this war camp that the Greeks made was massive. And they said something like 1,000 ships sailed to Troy. That's massive. And then you have the walls of Troy. These are just surface disturbances on the Earth that can be replaced. There is a tragedy and what's the word I'm looking for? And again, an insignificance to human struggles, and we'll get that from the divine perspective. And again, there's a sadness in that. Yeah, there won't even be wreckage left. Like, again, understand the destruction of Troy literally lays the foundation for what they think the fall of a city looks like. It is incredibly violent. It is an absolute, again, razing to the ground so there is absolutely nothing fucking left. And that's what then the Greeks from then on think it means for a city-state to fall. So it's terrifying to them. And we don't even see it in the Iliad, but they know it's coming. Yes, this is very much a war of attrition. It's become a war of attrition at this point. And that's very much what it's been for 9 years. They're tired. Feast on Olympus laughing. Yeah, sort of. Unless you're Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is just... he's special. So all the people who were playing... how come Poseidon sided with the Greeks since he helped build the walls? Because he felt insulted by the Trojans. He felt they didn't give him enough props for helping to build the walls, and he was like, what the fuck? Like, they definitely gave a lot of props to Apollo, but gave Poseidon very little, and he goes, oh, fuck you guys. So, yes. Yeah, like, exactly. Like, there might have been some sort of cultural memory of something happened. Like the burning of Pylos in 12... Yeah, exactly. Like, the idea of what a fall of a city was, like, in the same way that we think of the cultural memory of the blowing of Mount Terra and how that filtered down into literature. Like, something could have happened that gave them an idea of what it meant when a city fell. Absolutely, Mariana. So then, let's talk about the players in this great tragedy. Let's talk about the Greek heroes. Because this is going to be all about the Greek heroes, the Greek kings, the Greek warriors. We're going to get a shit ton of them. We're going to get a lot of Trojan ones too, but we'll focus on the Greeks here. Who are the Greek heroes? Let's define them, why don't we? In ancient Greek traditions, the Greek hero was a human, male or female, though they were predominantly male. There were a couple female ones, but not that many. Of the remote past, who had seemingly superhuman abilities at times, that they might even be compared to gods, get called godlike. They are humans who are so preeminent in their particular sphere of power and prowess that they can impose their will on others with the confidence and unquestioning certainty of their own right and worth. Basically, I am that fucking good, do as I say. And the ancient Greeks recognized that these heroes had essentially transcended the baseline of humanity to such a point that you will get hero cult worship. They might worship them after their death. Yeah, emotional support war criminal, select screen. Pick your favorite war criminal, absolutely. It is, however, important, extremely important to note. These stories of the Greek heroes often, usually do, include them committing deeds that are extremely morally questionable. These heroes might be, and frankly usually were, violent, basically antisocial at times, and destructive. But they equally offer an assurance to mortals and to the ancient Greeks that in some particular people, humans are capable of seemingly superhuman greatness. There are some humans who can basically deny the imperatives by which others are ordered to live. This idea of the excellent individual. Again, why for me? The idea that the Greeks believed some dude named Homer wrote these two incredible works, the idea of the excellent individual, makes complete sense. They loved that idea. Even in like the classical period when they start recounting wars and talking about like defenses of cities or whatever, even though yes, these are big group efforts and there's lots of people involved, they will attribute it to a single individual because they love the most excellent individual. The narrative of the excellent individual is a personal favorite of theirs. That's why you have the Greek heroes. But it's really important to note the greatest of heroes, all of them, these heroes, have to be mortal. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, before I even got there. It is essential to keep in mind that whenever heroes commit deeds that violate moral codes, these are not condoned by the heroic narrative. The idea of the pollution or the corruption of the hero in myth was really common and kind of relevant to their worship of them. So look, these guys are going to do things that are terrible. When they do things that are not in line with the moral codes of the time, the narrative is not going to reward them for it. They would not say, but that's okay. They go, no, that's not okay. What the fuck? That's why you have often a lot of these heroes have really ridiculous, have downfalls. It's very normal. Anyway, again, as I was saying before, the greatest of heroes must be mortal. They have to be mortal. Even though it is basically a requirement, they are descended in some way or other from one of the immortal gods, and that doesn't matter how many generations removed. No matter how godlike they get described as, they are mortals. They are subject to death and to dying. It makes you realize that the intrusion of even a single mortal into a bloodline, no matter how many gods are in there beforehand, will make every successive descendant mortal. Mortality, basically, if we're talking genetics, is the dominant gene. It overrides everything. Even in the case of somebody like Heracles, who again is the guy, and he goes through a whole apotheosis. He has to die first in order for that to happen, and he does have a mortal shade that's in the underworld. It's all confusing and weird, but everybody gotta die. In the course of the life of a hero, whether it's in suffering or disaster or fucking up or whatever, they will eventually come to realize their limits. They will come to accept their mortality and eventually kind of reestablish a human relationship with their other men. Even though they seem to like hit a level of audacity and power that seems ridiculous, at some point they gotta come back down, right? So mortality, that you must die, that idea, is the dominant theme of the stories of the Greek hero. And it is one of the biggest things for the heroes in the Iliad. They are basically obsessed with death in a way, because that idea of mortality and everything that comes with it defines the heroic life. In the same way, their death here in battle, in all its various stunning varieties, it's acceptable. It's universally acceptable. In short, as we say, the Greek hero can be immortalized in that they might get worshipped in a hero cult or something, but it is a fact that the hero is not in any way immortal. So the Iliad, in that way, is a story of a hero's pain, which will culminate in an anger that degrades him to the level of a savage animal. I mean, to the depths, and we're talking about Achilles, to the depths of bestiality. And it is this same pain, this kind of heroic, and I'm not gonna get into that word yet, because those words for anger and pain, all of that, when we actually start reading, we'll go into that. I'm saving that for later. I don't want to give too much away. What happens is that same anger needs to subside. Eventually, like we're following the course of one dude's anger. And when that anger and that rage and that pain finally subsides, in a moment of sort of, as would get called the heroic self, you recognize that I am just human and we're all just human. That is when Achilles will reach this highest levels, they would say, of like humanity in a way. And again, you can argue over that with modern morality and etc. So the reason they get obsessed with their with death and their deeds and all of this, and we're going to see all the arguments about Time and Kleos and all of that, it's because the hero and the story of the Greek hero cannot be complete if he's still alive, because in death, that is when the hero gets the ultimate prize of life eternal in song. That is your kleos, your glory. And that is because the Greek word kleos, which means glory or fame, can also translate as that which is heard, or it can mean a poem or song that conveys glory, fame, and that which is heard. Conventionally refers to the glory of song, unlike the hero, as the glory of song, because unlike a hero, the hero's glory in song never dies. It is as close as a mortal human will get to immortality, is through something like kleos. It is we use kleos to describe not only this kind of glory, and it's used in Greek poetry to refer to these poems and songs that are sung of these people, of the heroes of the distant past, as well as also the gods. So this also does apply to gods. The difference between Achilles and the suitors: the heroes of Achilles recognize they have messed up and learn from it. Achilles and the suitors are nowhere near each other. Like, don't ever try to compare them. Nobody in analysis compares the suitors and Achilles. Achilles does one thing that is terrible: what he does to Hector's body. That's the one thing where they go, abso-fucking-lutely not. Everything else, we can look at it one way. But, like, the ancient Greeks would go, I mean, okay. I mean, you do you, bud. These are very self-obsessed people, very purposefully. They're all there for individual goals. The suitors are just villains. They are villains from the jump. They are always villains. There's nothing they can do that can, frankly, save them from their fate, because they will never be forgiven. So I wouldn't try to... The difference between Achilles and the suitors is multiple books long. They're not comparable. So the reason we say that Kleos, glorifies these heroes as well as the gods, I mean, really again goes to the idea of what will be the hero cult, and because this is a song culture and everybody is chasing this. So you have to wonder, Kleos, it's so important. Like, why is Kleos so important that, I mean, these people, the Achaeans, even the Trojans, but the Achaeans who we focus on, the Greeks, they're willing to die for it. Achilles just being awful is just Tuesday. I mean, what do you mean Achilles being awful? Again, the one terrible thing he does is what he does to Hector's body. Nothing else he does is particularly, air quotes, awful compared to what we see. We in the modern day might find him petty and ridiculous and all of that, but the ancient Greeks were just like, so what? He's like... This is stuff that really we're going to tackle in book 1, but you see him as awful. I mean, it just sort of depends what side you're on, I guess, but the worst thing he does comes in, like, the second to last, or, like, in one of the later books. It's what he does to Hector's body. That's the one thing he really does really like, you done fucked up, Ron. Yeah, he's mostly just obnoxious, as they all are, basically. So the reason the Greeks are all willing and ready to die for something like Kleos is because, we say, the immortalizing power of Kleos' epic glory will be described in the Iliad by this Greek word, which is aphthiton, which means imperishable. This is as close as humans can get to the immortality of the gods, because in a song culture like that of the ancient Greeks, something like a song can be just as real as the actual event itself. I mean, we are going to see that Achilles will choose the glory of epic song with this thing that's of art over his own life. I mean, he will destine himself for death. Is this why, even though they aren't divine, we still hear about, example, the cult of Odysseus and the cult of Dionysus? Or Diomedes? Yes, hero cults. We hear about these cults, yes. They are worshipped like gods. They are not considered gods, but they are worshipped in that way similarly, because they are these excellent individuals, these hero cults. Exactly. I mean, and look, for the Greek hero, this ultimate real-life experience is death. Like, they're all chasing to have the perfect death. And in some situations, death is an alternative to sex. Like, that is how obsessed they are with this, because they all want the kleos. Death is the defining moment of reality for the hero. It is not meant to be feared, but welcomed. Ultimately, if you achieve the perfect moment of the perfect death, and that perfect moment of perfect death must then be recorded in song, kleos. Glory. A thing which essentially is almost like currency to them. It's so important to them. So like I said, the Greek heroes we're going to see feel a need then to almost like script their own death, especially with their dying words. The dying words of a hero are really important. It can be seen as like their swan song, and if you don't know what I mean by swan song, it's said in tradition, the idea of the swan sings its most beautiful song as it dies. So it's like a hero's dying words are as important as everything else. So everyone is trying to out Leroy Jenkins each other. To a degree, it's more, there's a phrase, I didn't want to get to it yet, but since we're all basically jumping ahead, even though I haven't even started talking about Achilles and all of that yet, there's a quote from, if anybody has seen the miniseries Band of Brothers. In episode 3, there's a man named Captain Spears, or at the time he's a Lieutenant Spears, and he has this speech he gives to a character. They're talking about fear, and he says, he's asking a character named Blythe. He says, do you know why you hid in that ditch, Blythe? Blythe says, because I was scared. And Spears says, we're all scared. You hid in that ditch because you still have hope. But Blythe, the only hope you have is to accept the fact that you're already dead. Only then will you be able to function the way a soldier is expected to function, without compassion, without remorse. All war depends on it. They are all in a way accepting the fact they are going to die. In fact, they are making sure if they do, they go out in a blaze of glory, as we might say. Is that why Agamemnon's death was so particularly heinous, the loss of Cleos? And also because he was betrayed by his wife. Yeah, his death is considered particularly tragic to the Greeks. Mm-hmm. So, let's talk about two of the big heroes. I mean, we're going to look at, mind you, a lot of heroes, but the two I wanted to talk about in this introduction and kind of overview and contrast are Hector and Achilles. Because ultimately, the story is going to be building to their duel. Like, we know the duel is inevitably going to happen, and it's going to be crucial in many ways. So let's look at Hector and look at Achilles. So Hector exists as the only thing that could possibly let Troy survive this war. The problem is that even though with this devotion, this courage, I mean, incessant effort, Hector works goddamn overtime to possibly try and let Troy survive. And though he is a formidable warrior, let's make no bones about it, even the Greeks greatly respect Hector. They know he's good. War is not his native element. He is a man made for peace. A lot of his relationships and interactions we see and where he often excels are those which demand sympathy, kindness, persuasion, and sure, firmness where firmness is necessary, but it's in forms of like law and governance and granted authority. It is all in a state of I am a king, a almost kingly but princely figure. It's important that our first view we're gonna get of Hector, which is in book 3, it's not him fighting. It's actually him attempting to stop fighting by announcing Paris's offer to fight Menelaus to settle the war. And what he does to do this would blow the minds of everybody, including the Greeks. The people who would listen would go, oh. Again, the Greeks greatly respect him. What he basically does is walk out in front of the lines while the Greeks then start shooting arrows at him. And he's basically holding out his spear, stopping the Trojans from advancing, and just holding the line in front of everybody in full danger such that literally the Greeks go, stop firing. I think he needs to say something. Like, it's something that shows such a force of personality And it demands and commands such intense authority that, again, both sides recognize this. The Greeks, again, do greatly respect Hector. And they, real recognizes real. I know we all agree Paris is the worst, but would he be considered a hero or does he not fit the criteria? No, he is not a hero. He would not be considered a hero in any regard, as Mariana says. He refuses to fight for Cleo's thing. He'd much rather avoid everything. So the war is over the second Achilles kills Hector. At this point, it's a case of when, not if. Yeah, because it's also, the moment he kills Hector, he knows also he is doomed to die, too. In a way, yeah, once they lose Hector, it's pretty much done. It's done once they lose Hector. He's carrying the whole goddamn thing on his shoulders. I wouldn't say he's too good for this world. Like, he's not perfect. He's got his stuff. But he's not fit for this kind of war. He's not in his native element here. And it's actually, we're going to see, he's going to reveal the kind of tragic dilemma he's facing to his wife, Andromache. It's the idea is like, he's the leader and the commander, so he can't be defensive. He, like back on the walls, the way the older men who are no longer fighting are, he has to go on the front lines, and he's got to put himself in the thick of it. He understands that's important. And we'll see, again, when I talk about Hector more in book 3, we see that his name actually means holder, essentially, is what it translates out etymologically as. So he holds the Trojan defense steady by example. He's got to fight on the front ranks. He's literally, as I say, he is Atlas holding up the whole fucking sky that is the Trojan defense. Like, he's been put in such an impossible situation. But he performs fucking admirably. He's good. He's really good. He's just not as good as these Greeks because he's not as at home with this as the Greeks are. He can't be quite as savage and brutal as they are. He can be savage and brutal, let's make no mistake. But they're on a different level. They are way more accustomed to war than he is. As we say, in addition, the standards of martial valor by which he has always lived are not going to allow him to fall back and fight from the walls. Even though he knows this immense effort he's giving, he knows it's ultimately futile. He knows he ultimately can't hold out. There's no way if it's just him, Troy will hold out, that even he will hold out. He also, in that way, accepts he's going to die at some point. He doesn't know exactly how or when. He knows it will happen, though. Again, they're all, these great heroes have accepted the fact that they're basically already dead. Because the idea is like, no matter how well-founded a foreboding of the future and how tragic it might seem, you have to brush it aside to move on and push forward. And this is, so as we see, the greatness of Hector is that he's presented as a very complete individual. Part of the reason I think a lot of people end up loving Hector as a character, even in the Iliad, and again, the Greeks greatly respected Hector, is that he seems like this very complete individual. We see both the devotion of the warrior who does his duty and fights for his people and for his polis, which again, the ancient Greeks would fully respect. But we also see his greatness as a husband and a father. But we're not going to get that with the Greeks because none of their children and their wives are here. They are far from home. Home is almost like a distant memory to them. But we get to see Hector on the home front. So in a way, he has that advantage of being the complete man because we see him that way. The disadvantage is that those same things which make him great at home are not helpful in this war. And so even when we're going to see him in this kind of the berserk fury that is the fighting, we're going to see it again. We're going to see a lot of fighting. Hector's is not that of the hero-ness, is still oftentimes the fury of the guy who's fighting for the polis, the guy who's fighting for home. He's the protector of the community. It's not necessarily, although there is an element of that, don't get me wrong, but it's not his fully always driving focus of the individual rage or the individual glory or the war booty. Like, he's not a Diomedes or an Achilles or any of these other Greeks who are, I mean, especially someone like Achilles and aka Achilles, who is there solely for himself. Like, Hector has the element of I am defending my city. He has the extra added element. So we see him as a far more complete individual. I mean, he has one of the most famous lines from the Iliad, which will be translated here as, fight for your country, that is the best, the only omen. And I'm telling you, again, the Greeks admired him, not just in the story, but ancient Greeks of later ages admire Hector. Like, that phrase, fight for your country, that is the only omen, That is the best, the only omen. They will hang on to that line and use it because to them that is patriotic courage. And they love that. They love that. So Hector is the idea of the lord of the battlefield, and for a good long time in the epic poem is going to be able to claim he's the best guy out there. Yes, as Bernard Knox wrote, that is the mood that inspires men to defend their own city, great or small, in the face of overwhelming odds, hostile portents, and omens of disaster. Again, Hector knows ultimately they are probably fighting a futile battle. They are ultimately probably going to lose. But he can claim for most of the poem to be the best guy out there. But that's because we haven't seen Achilles. When Achilles finally steps on the battlefield, taking center stage, and this is book I think, 21 or 22? 21 and 22. Books 21 and 22 are when Achilles finally steps on the battlefield. What we see, what Homer creates for us, is an almost irresistible, can't turn your eyes away from it, violence of a man who was born and shaped for battle. He values life, and that's his own included, as nothing. Bernard Knox uses the phrase, the killer in his own domain, lion in the bush, shark in the water, and it is then we realize Hector's defeat and his death are inevitable. The moment Achilles rolls up, everybody recognizes Hector is fucked. Because violence is Achilles' is it spelled Achilleos? The way that I'm saying it, it would be, I'll type it in here. That's how I say it. That comes from I get that from the Lattimore translation. Most people will say Achilles. Either work. Violence is Achilles' native element. It's only in violence we see his full power and ability exerted, his talents fully employed. It comes out in violence. Because he has would Hector have gone to Elysium? I don't know. I don't think he's listed as going to Elysium. But I don't know. I don't think the Greeks would have cared that much. Again, they're not really that concerned with what happens to you after death. Because understand, Achilles, has deliberately chosen the sphere of activity that is violence, basically, in which he is seemingly invincible, even though he knows it's going to end in his early death. He has chosen this death and glory at Troy, and the natural consequence of that choice is a very fierce devotion to that glory, which he has accepted and preferred over living a long life. This is literally, he defines himself by this. His very existence is forged and defined by this. And so any diminution of that glory, any that comes with having this glorious death, or a suggestion that he is not at the very center of this world of violence, is an absolutely intolerable insult. It's what's gonna kick off the events of book one. Agamemnon's going to make comments to him in book one that strike not only at the roots of his pride, which that pride coming from his devotion to Cleos, again, this thing that Achilles prizes above life itself, including his own life, is going to basically amount to a denial of his right to exist. Achilles is the name, violence is the trade. So when Agamemnon does what he does, it's basically saying, Achilles takes that to mean, so I shouldn't exist. You are insulting my very reason for existing. So, because to Achilles, honor is more important, his honor is more important than that of other men, because he's already chosen an early death for honor's sake. He is not in any way looking to survive this war. Look, a lot of these heroes accept the fact that they're already dead. They accept that they may die. Achilles has accepted he will die at Troy. A lot of these other kings are saying, I may die at Troy. But they might not. They might survive. Achilles has no intention of surviving Troy. None whatsoever. He went in knowing it was a death mission. He's accepted this in a way that none of these other heroes have. Hence, why any potential insult to that Kleos he is seeking, that he has accepted, that he knows is going to happen, that's why it hits so deep with him. So, this is going to lead to Achilles sitting out. Because these Greek warriors are far more self-centered than Hector and some of the other Trojans will appear. Again, because they're not defending home. They're not thinking about home. Right now, it's all about themselves. Understandably, for the culture in the period. Now, the Achaeans are going to say, well, fine, we'll fight without you. They try. It won't go well. They will then try and beg Achilles to come back. He'll kind of half-ass it, so he won't come back, but he'll send out Patroclus and some of the Myrmidons. But then when he does finally... Oh yeah, as I say, he half-asses it. He assists them to a point. Because he wants to feel like the Greeks have been, all of them, mind you, not just Agamemnon, everyone. He wants to feel every other Achaean has been suitably punished for the wrong he feels he has been done. He will help them to a point initially, which is why he sends Patroclus as his proxy. He's going to enter the war in Achilles' armor and assist the Achaeans in throwing off Hector's assault, but Achilles makes it clear that Patroclus is not to go too far. He is only to drive the Trojans back from the Greek ships, especially his own. He's not to try to assault Troy. That's because Patroclus is only supposed to win glory for Achilles by beating off the Trojan attack. But to do more would bring glory to Patroclus, not to Achilles, because eventually they're all going to realize it's Patroclus. So he's like, don't do that. It's still all about me. Very important here. Nobody would have befriended Patroclus if he was as soft as fandom has made him. None of them would. That Patroclus would be dead. Seriously. Because ultimately, what does Achilles want? If Achilles knew it was a suicide mission, how come he tried to leave? Wouldn't that cause a paradox, or was he only doomed after killing Hector and could have saved himself before then? No. The killing of Hector means your death is following soon after it. He knew he was going to live a very short life. He knew he was going to die there. He may not have known exactly when he would die at Troy. But he did get told, when you kill Hector, your death is going to follow pretty quickly after. I mean, let's remember, the Iliad covers X number of months in year 9, and Achilles dies before the Trojan horse happens. So he's dying within the next couple months after this story. He doesn't really try to leave. He doesn't ever really try to leave. And while there's a lot of potential philosophical irreconcilables and kind of seeming paradoxes, he was never really going to leave. He can't. He's defined by this existence he's lived, and there's no way he'll ever leave. So what does Achilles want? What does he want? What he ultimately wants is a world that contains nothing but himself and his own glory. It is the peak of self-obsession. So, upon Patroclus' death, and at that point, the rage that Achilles has been feeling shifts from being aimed at all the Greeks who he felt did him wrong to Hector. He does also accept that his death is going to follow swiftly on the heels of Hector's. But please note, it is not out of any sort of devotion to Patroclus as an individual. It's because he's not avenging necessarily Patroclus as an individual, his death by killing Hector. Because if he didn't do that, it would be a renunciation of everything Achilles stands for and lived by, which is this attainment of glory, universal recognition. There's no man on his equal in the battlefield among the Achaeans. Because Patroclus went out as Achilles' proxy. He went out basically as a pseudo-Achilles. And he got defeated by Hector. Ooh, that stings at Achilles' pride. He cannot accept or take that. He cannot take that in any respect. To just roll over and take that would be him basically being like a hypocrite beyond bounds, because what do you mean you took that kind of insult to your pride and did nothing about it? Absolutely not. No. He has to go avenge Patroclus for that very reason, for his own pride, because nobody can be better on the battlefield than him. No, he refuses to accept that in any respects. And since again, Patroclus went out as a proxy of Achilles, that would imply that Hector is better than Achilles, and Achilles cannot take that. Hector being better than all the other Greeks means nothing to Achilles, but Hector being better than Achilles? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Again, these Greek heroes are pretty self-obsessed. It's a core trait, and Achilles is going to take that to a next level of this kind of self-absorption kind of thing. But that's what's going through his head there, and I think it's really important to keep in mind that, again, these are very self-obsessed, self-driven individuals. And again, when he takes to the field, in books 21 and 22, the violence that comes out of his taking of the field makes anything we've seen before, and that includes Diomedes battling gods, look like fucking child's play. That kind of violence, the violence that Achilles is going to wreak, is going to be on a level unseen even in the Iliad. And the Iliad is going to show us a lot of fucking violence. As Bernard Knox says, Homer shows us a picture of supreme violence in Achilles, goaded to fury at the highest pitch of its most relentless skill and strength when he finally does take the field. We have wound him up to a point that he has completely, truly blown his gasket, and he reaches a level of essentially insanity. And the new object of his rage is the Trojans, but even more specifically Hector. And Achilles is going to cut down anyone, any Trojan in his way as he goes to get after Hector. And I mean, when I tell you he cuts down anyone in his way, it's fucking over.
Could you try again?
What you're going to see is the very definition of overkill. Yeah, in a way. In a way. It's absolute overkill, is what he goes out and wreaks on the Trojans while pursuing Hector. Because those who are not like immediately cut down, some of them run into the river. Achilles is going to go into the river after them and kill them in the water. Any Trojan who cannot run their way back inside the walls, through the gate, where Hector is standing, ready, waiting to meet Achilles, is going to die at the hand of Achilles. Again, he rolls in like an absolute cruise missile and just hacks and slashes his way through. And he's not going to take any prisoners. There is, like, the thought of ransoming prisoners, it's not there. She don't go here. This is about violence and death. And that is all that is on his mind, is destruction. So what we see in Achilles, and what we will see, especially as we build him and build him and build him, we break him, basically, he will eventually have to return to humanity at the end of the Iliad. It's the whole point of the story. So that whole stage of building and then eventually coming back to humanity is basically psychological insight that's pretty spectacular when you consider it was written down nearly 3,000 years ago. Because ultimately, Achilles, after going through all of this, is going to have to come to know himself. And what he's going to have to relearn is compassion and pity for others, including the other with a capital O. And understand and have empathy for them, which these other heroes, as much as they are tired and they are, on edge and everything else, there is still an element of basic human empathy in there. It just doesn't serve them, and they understand that, but they still recognize everybody as human. Achilles reaches a point where nobody else is human. Even he doesn't see himself as human. It's beasts and animals, it's slaughter. He has to come to recognize that bit of empathy and learn to feel compassion for his enemy. And in that, he will show self-knowledge, self-realization, and act to prevent the calamity that his violent temper that he has might bring about. It's about as close as he will ever get to something like self-criticism and self-reflection. And at that point, he stops from being this seeming godlike, Achilles that's just berserker on the battlefield, unstoppable, to something more like a human. And at that point, he is able to cast aside his personal wrongs in sympathy for another human being. And that human being, of course, will be Priam, the father of Hector, the king of Troy. So it's pretty powerful when we get there. But you have to build him to an almost animalistic state to then have that, right? So, Hector the complete man, Achilles the almost godlike, psychotic warrior. What happens what do we have when we put them against each other? Because the entire poem, mind you, moves towards this climactic duel between Achilles and Hector, which you, again, are not going to get until books like 21 and 22, really book 22 of the Iliad. You're almost done with the Iliad at that point. You only got a couple books after it. Whole poem is building through 20 plus books to get you there, right? Even though we are building all those books to it, there's never any doubt as to what the outcome is going to be. We all know Hector is going to lose. Not just because, we know, but because it's just so clear it's going to happen. Because Hector, the husband, the father, protector of his people, the guy who's standing for all these civilized values of a rich city, including all of its institutions, is going to have to, inevitably, of course he will, go down in defeat at the hands of the man who seems his total opposite. He has no present family, who's in a private quarrel and thinks only of revenge. And that's including even though that revenge he knows is going to be an immediate prelude to his own death. Achilles is like, I don't care if this kills me. I don't care if I'm dying the next day. I will settle my personal grievance. He's thinking of nothing else. Hector has to think of everything else, in addition to his own personal glory. He's never going to survive the guy who's got the laser focus on him. It's not quite the same, but it's almost like Kendrick versus Drake. Drake got too many mind. Kendrick, laser focused on the opponent. That's Achilles when he sets out to take on Hector and every other Trojan in his path. He doesn't care who his collateral damage is. He wants to get Hector. Hector's thinking about everything else. Achilles doesn't have to. He doesn't have to think about home or protecting anything other than his own self. He's got a bit of an easier job in that regard. I don't think it's fair to equate Hector with Drake, but you get what I'm saying when I'm talking the amount of focus somebody has. Again, unfair to equate Hector with Drake, but you get what I'm saying, right? And of course, we understand that Hector's death seals Troy's fate. It's going to fall to the Achaeans. It's going to be the pattern for all time of the death of a city and reinforce what we say is Homer's stern lesson in this presentation of war. And again, I quote, "No civilization, no matter how wealthy, no matter how rich, no matter how refined, can long survive once it loses the power to meet force with equal or superior force." They needed Hector for that. The moment they lost it, they could not meet on equal or superior force. I mean, they were making reasonably equal force. The moment they lose Hector, they lose the ability to do that. They will not survive long, right? Now, again, to see the contrast in Hector versus Achilles. Hector's going to offer Achilles the same pact that he offers Telamonian Ajax earlier in the poem, because they're going to have their own duel. Basically, the winner can take the opponent's armor. Again, this is totally normal shit that happens. You loot the bodies of the dead. But give over the body for a proper funeral. Funerals are important. And the reason we see how Achilles has reached an almost non-human kind of psychosis in a way is that he refuses. He refuses that outright. We all know from the start Hector was marked for death. Would Hector have known he was on borrowed time? He knows he's mortal, but I mean, knowing he seems to have an idea. He's getting a feeling he's probably not going to make it. He understands, like, does he know, like, a prophecy? No. Does he suspect he's not going to make it? Yeah, absolutely. Again, accept the fact that you're already dead. He accepts that he will probably die, but he doesn't know exactly how or when. Not in the way that Achilles understands once he kills Hector, his death is coming real fast after that, because, like, prophecy. Again, the thing that separates Achilles in his refusal of this is that he recognizes that this is not, in his mind, a formal duel. He's no Ajax. I mean, again, Achilles is almost not even human at this point. As the poem would see it, he's going to be described as godlike. He's both greater and lesser than a man. He's almost bestial in the way that he behaves. There is something where you're like, oh, fuck. Like, that you just don't take that on. You can't. Like, what do you do with that? This guy's not even operating in the realm of humanity at that point. It's a contrast between very raw, self-absorbed fury, Achilles, and civilized responsibility and seeming restraint of Hector. And it's maintained pretty much to the end. Because again, even as they're setting up to duel, Hector's like, look, we'll make a deal. The line that's in Troy, there are no pacts between lions and men. That is ripped straight from Homer. Literally, like, what Achilles says to him. He's like, absolutely, like, he compares himself to the lion. He doesn't even see himself as human anymore. Because it is Hector who must and will die. And Achilles is, again, he's going to exult over his fallen enemy the way we're going to see lots of people do it. His words are going to slam home the fact that he is fighting for himself alone. He's got no city-state to defend, no wife and child who are there, present, watching. This is all about him. And that's when, again, we will see Achilles reveal the extremity of this inhuman hatred because that he has reached. Like, he's going to say, I will cut out your heart and eat it. Consumption of human flesh. Like, whoa. People are going to be like, holy shit, this guy has lost it, in a way. This hate that Achilles is going to have, this rage, this wrath, this hatred, this is how the gods hate. This is a level of fury that is implacable. You can't reason with it. You can't appease it. The only thing that has changed between this rage he had at the beginning and the rage we have now, it's just shifted focus. It's narrowed even in its focus. I mean, initially it's Agamemnon, but he punishes all the Greeks for it. In this case, he's mad at Hector. And so to quote Aristotle here, the man who is incapable of working in common or who has in his self-sufficiency no need of others is no part of the community, like a beast or a god. So Achilles basically says, I need nobody but myself. I'm going to take you on. He becomes a beast-like and godlike, and it's all about him then returning to humanity. You need the community. You need the people around you. You need to remember that. That's the psychological journey we're going to take Achilles on. Even the very first sentence. Yes, trust me, when we hit book 1, we're going to have a whole long talk about the first word of the poem, both in English and in Greek, which is the same. And, yeah, we'll have a whole talk about that because it's important. So, getting an idea of how these, the Greek hero functions. I know it's not told in the Iliad, the whole Weeds of Time thing, but we do have a rough time frame how long after kill it. Like, a couple months, I think. Like months. Very quickly after. Like less than a year. Because it's before the Trojan horse. And so, exact details, I think it's just sort of like a month. Or it might even just be 1 month. It's like 1 or 2 months afterward. It's very quickly after. Very quickly. So, themes, war, warfare, these Greek heroes, Hector and Achilles, the differences between the two. So let's talk about one of the other big, we'll say, thematic elephants in the room. Fate, destiny, will, force, free will, all these things. Oh boy, get ready. In Homer in particular, and especially in this poem, like there's a bit of it in the Odyssey, it's way more center stage in this one. A lot of this stuff is, there's a bunch of this that is often very much featured in the Odyssey, but it's just way more center stage in the Iliad. There is a correlation between divine intervention and independent human action, right? they seem to work together. Sometimes even the same thing, just viewed in different angles. Basically, the idea of like, there are times in Iliad where man comes to decision, chooses between alternatives, and the god is not involved in him coming to this decision or the suggestions and doing anything at all. Hey, the gods aren't intervening. Because ultimately, divine intervention and human responsibility coexist. It's not one or the other, it's both. Welcome to the world of philosophical irreconcilables. This is the part where you try and write papers on it and your head hurts. Destiny and its vocal element prophecy versus the will of Achilles and the will of Zeus. These philosophical irreconcilables are presented to us in Homer. We are expressly told in the beginning that events are determined by the will of Zeus. And yet more than once, the will of Zeus is thwarted by fate. And it's because the coexistence of these things that should not exist together, is not necessarily something that only Homer did. It's not confined to his imagination. Again, to quote, "If any civilization which makes a place in its thought for the idea of free will, independent human action, and individual responsibility, and pattern, aka you look for an overall meaning. You have these two concepts, the fixed and the free. Basically, is it fate or do I have a choice? That constant battle, the philosophical argument. These things exist uneasily side by side. You have to have both. Because, if we think about it, again, brief sort of tangent into philosophy here, and I'm quoting a lot from Knox, the only escape from such a contradiction, a logical contradiction, is either one, the prison of what gets called rigid determinism. Basically, fate, a pattern, is fixed from the beginning and is not subject to change. Or you go with B, complete freedom and free will, which just means anarchy in an unpredictable universe. Oh God. Greek thought, which is presented here in Homer, tries to embrace the logical contradiction of freedom and free will and order/fate, prophecy. And it sees that combined. So ultimately in Homer, the idea of destiny, of things that are fixed, it's actually pretty flexible. Like Zeus can predict the future, but it's impossible to say whether the result is destiny, his will, or a bit of both. It's all kind of left up for you to interpret. Again, this is why it makes people's head spins. Because sometimes even the possibility is raised that things that are fated are actually annulled, basically canceled out by divine will, or even the will of very specific humans. It is thought possible that a human can somehow break pattern. Basically, you could say maybe defy destiny. In fact, he must be, and in fact, that idea is that that mortal must then be prevented. Similarly, Zeus can break patterns. Basically, quote, destiny could theoretically be defied, but only at the risk of chaos. To quote Bernard Knox, we have seen and may yet see again similar situations, and when catastrophe comes on us in spite of the universal desire to avoid it, we fall back on explanations that are likely more sophisticated, but no more unsatisfactory. The irrationality of human nature, the will of history, the will of gods, or even pure accident. These explanations are just as metaphysical as Homer's gods. So basically, while they might have used the gods to explain shit that they couldn't understand, we just go, I don't know, maybe it was an accident, dumb luck, whatever. We come up with our own reasons. They're all kind of on the same train of thought. Fate, free will, destiny. Keep them in mind, because you're going to see a lot of talk about it, and the idea is they all exist uncomfortably together. And it makes your head hurt. So then, since we've talked about them a little bit, let's talk about the gods, the Theoi. Hi. Can I have a kiss? Thank you. Good kisses. Okay. Again, we quote Bernard Knox. Lots of quotes from him. He's got good quotes. The Homeric gods, the gods, are the personification of those mysterious forces which, through their often violent interaction, produce the harsh patterns of human life. The rise and fall of nations, the destructiveness of the earthquake, the terror of the flood, the horrors of the plague, but also the sweetness of passionate love, the intoxication of wine, the extra strength that surges through a warrior's limb at the moment of danger. And Unkay always creeps in somehow. Oh God, real. So the gods, imagined in the likeness of mankind, in all his strength and weakness, but magnified in scale, are symbolic of these aspects of life that seem kind of incomprehensible and uncontrollable. It's not, and they're, and the way we are going to look at the gods in the Iliad, especially because a lot of this is their interactions with war, it's not a modern way of looking at warfare and at battle, but their direct intervention by joining in the fighting kind of does, in that way, express one might say the mysteries of combat, which is morale. You know, unpredictable currents of aggressive courage, faltering panic, this thing that can sweep through armies. Morale. The gods function almost like morale in that regard. You think of Napoleon, once said that morale was 3 times as important as materiel. And you cannot feed morale into a computer or into simulations. That idea of the human element, that little thing that'll kick in, that it'll make these, like, we are outgunned, outmanned, you're hard pressed. Suddenly you will go on the offense and you'll completely turn the tide. Or it can make somebody who's advancing in victory suddenly be like, I think we've got, I think we're gonna get outflanked or something, and all of a sudden they do something and causes panic and they lose. The idea is that battle is always unpredictable. And look, even nowadays, modern historians they find it impossible to explain in purely rational terms how some individuals accomplish what they do. Like, for example, how do you explain Joan of Arc doing what she did? Modern historians still sometimes go, honestly, look, what she did was bonkers. How? We don't really know. What do you? I mean, like, back then they'd tell you will of God, but now what do we call that? We still kind of look at it going, it's just pretty wild, ain't it? That's what, in a way, the Homeric gods coming down on the battlefield is like. It's inexplicable, right? It's unpredictable. So when these gods, our gods, when we see our gods take the battlefield, and let's be real, they're mostly fighting each other. They're not really fighting humans. They're fighting each other. We get the spectacle of God fighting God, which you don't see, like, really on a battlefield. You really don't see that often in mythology. But of course, the whole thing is that any wounds they're going to deal to each other, they're going to heal quickly. And even if they don't heal that quickly, like, oh God, you have to wait an extra day, the gods are exempt from the ultimate consequence of action, death. No matter what they do, they will not die. They will survive. And that is the crucial difference between gods and men, especially on the battlefield. It's what grants men sole ownership of the idea of true dignity in battle, because they can die. Ultimately, the gods' presence is almost an impertinence. To quote, again, Knox, he says, the immunity of the gods, who fight their mock battles while men stand and die, casts into mighty relief the tragic situation of the men who risk and suffer not only pain and mutilation, but the prospect, inevitable if the war goes on long enough, of death, of the total extinction of the individual personality. The gods have no fear of that. They never have to fear that. Because they are immortal, which means they're not subject to time, which means they're not really subject to change. Change is brought by age. It's by learning from suffering, realization of your limitations. The gods never have that. So they will always be what they are now and what they've always been. They are the same at the end of the Iliad as they were at the beginning. They do not change, nor could they. That is in stark contrast to what we're watching with Achilles. The whole thing is watching him change. You will never get that with a god. And sure, look, the gods, as far as personalities go, are really different to each other. They have one thing in common that comes from their immortality, which is, as Bernard Knox said, a furious self-absorption. They are extremely focused on themselves. They are each a separate force that doesn't question or examine the nature of its own existence. It will move almost blindly, ferociously, to the affirmation of its will and action. Basically, they recognize no authority outside themselves, except superior force, which is usually Zeus. There's no moral questioning in the clash of wills. It's just them intent on manifesting what they want in that moment. Excuse me. So to be a god is to be wholly absorbed in the exercise of one's own power and the fulfillment of one's own nature and desires. You are unchecked by any thought for others, except you might see them as obstacles to overcome. You are incapable of self-criticism, self-questioning, and even self-reflection. You are gods. You don't have to. You are unchanged by time. You will never die. Again, this is the thing that contrasts the gods and the mortals. And so when we talk about humans being called godlike, there's actually two in the Iliad. We've already talked about Achilles. Does anyone want to guess who the other one is? Who's the other human presented as godlike? Go ahead and take a guess. I want to see if anybody can get it right. Mariana, you don't count, because I know you probably know it. Okay. A lot of guesses here. I see Diomedes, I see Odysseus, I see Telamone and Ajax. A lot of people ranking on Diomedes. Okay. Oh, I was gonna say you're all wrong. Summer's ended. Helen. Summer's ended, you are correct. It's Helen. In what little we see of her. Mariana, yeah, lips zipped. It is Helen. Except the difference is she has already escaped what we could say is that prison of sort of self-absorption, which again, Helen is a tricky figure because you have to understand that had divine intervention, that had Aphrodite. But when we meet her, we're going to meet her for the first time in book 3. She feels responsible for all of the human misery she sees around her, which is something the gods could never do. Because for the gods, human suffering, it counts for nothing. It means nothing. The gods feel no responsibility for the human victims of any of their private wars. They don't care. Why should they? Humans live, they die. It's nothing to them. But Helen is going to come out onto the walls and look out, and she will feel responsible. She has already transcended that sense of thinking only of yourself. That sort of furious self-absorption that the gods have, that Achilles is going to have through the whole of the poem. So we're going to see her break that pattern, have basically already broken it. She feels extremely guilty, even though, again, we can argue, Helen made you do it. Aphrodite made you do it. But guilt is not always logical here. Because what we're going to see, instead of we see Helen basically freed from that prison of self-absorption, right? Achilles is going to enter that prison at the start of the poem when he kicks off his anger. We're going to see the origin of it. We're going to see the course of it, the consequences of it. And the thing is, the consequences of the rage that he feels it's, as I say, I'm calling it self-imposed imprisonment because that godlike heroic fury is lonely. It's lonely. Everything else, all the rest of the world is excluded until you return to human nature and humanity. Again, until you have empathy for other people. You think of someone other than yourself and what you want and your will and exercising your will. Helen's already out of that. Achilles is going to enter it, he's going to run the course of it, and will eventually leave it, but it'll take the whole damn poem. Helen and Diomedes does... Helen, I think, does also, yes, as a daughter of Zeus, and it gets, I believe she also enters into the Elysian fields with Menelaus in some versions. So the whole idea is that you're seeking a kind of final release. You need to let go of this. You return to humanity. It's going to be grim. Especially because the one we're really going to be focusing on is Achilles. It's going to be grim. Sorry, hold on. Damn, I forgot to plug in my phone this whole time. There we go. Got my phone. It only started dying now. It's going to be grim. It's going to be littered with the corpses of Greeks and Trojans alike. And the inevitable terminus of this is going to be Achilles' own inevitable death, which is so foreshadowed that even though we don't see it, it's like, yeah. To be godlike is a double-edged sword. Yes. To be described that way is very much a double-edged sword, because it means you have left the realm of humanity and you have to return to it. It's not always a fun time. It's true. Okay. So, finally, last little thing to keep in mind, the importance. Funerals. We're going to have a couple of them. We're going to have 2 different books that are really devoted to funerals and funerary games. Funerals are important. Again, the Greeks are not really concerned with what happens to the soul after death. They don't really care. Once the life leaves the body, I mean, you're on the way to the underworld. They don't really care. It's about the body. So, what you do with the body, you burn it on a pyre. It is at that point the hero's memory is celebrated with funeral games, which are contests, simulated combat. All these things are in honor of a fallen warrior. In fact, actually, the ancient Greeks believed that's the origin of the Pan-Hellenic games. So like the Olympian, the Pythian, the Nemean, the Isthmian, like all these different games they believe came from funerary games. Very specifically, it goes to the myth of Pelops winning his chariot race, which I'm not going to go into here because we're going to talk about it in a later book. We got to talk about Pelops because we got to talk about Tantalus because we got to talk about the house of Atreus. It's all wrapped up in that, but it is said that he essentially invented that, especially the chariot races part of it. That was kind of the origin of it. And it was a huge deal. So the honor that's paid to a dead man is marked by the richness of the prizes and the efforts of the contestants. So like, how much people gave a shit about you shows in like how good are the prizes and how hard are people trying, right? For example, we're going to see Patroclus' funeral games. The prizes are offered by Achilles. And that's also why he then does not compete in any of the contests, because he's the one giving the prize. Kind of doesn't make sense to offer the prize if you're going to then compete and try to win. That's kind of weird. It doesn't look good. And there were lots of different contests. There's just from... Wait, you burned the body. I thought you dragged it. I'm not answering that. I mean, a comment like that doesn't need the hand raised for it. So, kind of a list of some of the contests you'd have. Chariot races, boxing matches, wrestling. There'd be a foot race. There'd be fights in full armor. There'd be weight throwing, an archery contest. I mean, they went all out. Dude, your funeral was a goddamn party. And it's in these scenes we're going to see these great heroes, these Achaeans, locked not in combat, but in peaceful contest. Fierce effort, but peaceful contest. Homer's going to take, as we say, Homer will take the listener away from the grim business of war and the horror of things like Achilles' degradation of Hector's corpse, and show us a vision through Patroclus' funeral of what Achilles might have been in peace, if peace were a possibility in the heroic world. How he behaves at Patroclus' funeral shows that, damn, He could have been the complete man, but it doesn't work in this world. The Iliad might, as I said, we're going to end on the funeral of Hector. But it's not a peaceful ending. The funeral of Hector means the fighting will resume. Achilles is ultimately going to die, just as his mother Thetis tells him, and as Hector also basically tells him, with his dying breath, part of his swan song, as he tells him, you're going to die right after me. You're not going to, I can tell you won't last long after me. So, while the poem's very first lines give us the name of Achilles, so that we learn him, we know of Achilles, so does the final line remind us of Achilles, even though he's not there, because his death is going to come soon as the fighting resumes. As we note, the poem ends as it begins, on the eve of battle. And thus, you end it with as much sadness as all of the rest of them basically feel. Yeah, Hector's funeral is but a brief interlude, a brief breath before the storm resumes once again, and we are driving toward, and it's pretty much the last act. This is the beginning, really, of the last act for Troy. So there you go. It's a lot of stuff about the Iliad to keep in mind. I know that was a lot. Again, I will put these notes into the Discord in the Iliad Book Club section. But it's stuff that I wanted everybody to kind of get in mind and get your bearings with, because there's going to be some things to... You have to keep all these things in mind, because again, we're going to watch the humans of the Iliad behave, frankly, abominably. Everybody is going to behave terribly. Not just because this is war, but because of the culture, right? And to our modern sensibilities, what we see is petty and appalling and awful. It's it's terrible to them because they're like war, brutal necessity. And the reason that these tempers flare as hot as they do, as quickly as they do, there's just so much to keep in mind. In addition, the arguments of free will and fate and divine will and how all these things are fighting against each other, the importance of how there's a reason this is called the Iliad and not like the Achilles. That's something later that's never got finished, or something else. Why we have Hector and Achilles kind of, when we're eventually going to have them duel, why are they so contrasted with each other? Understanding kind of the mentality of the Greek hero. It's okay. No, the joke is fine. It's just if you put the hand up, I assume you have like an actual question, and that just sort of distracts me. So there's that. Hi, Q. So yeah, it's basically, and going into again war and warfare and how the gods are kind of going to function and why there is that contrast between them and humans, which again, as I always say, it comes down to the gods don't die. That's literally like, if you want to core a thing on which the axis turns, it's that they don't die. Keeping all of these things in mind kind of as we go through, I think can help better understand some of the psychology of what you're seeing, why people are behaving the way they do, why some things were drawing importance to them. There's a reason behind a lot of it, and that's very surface level. Should I make another bingo? You are welcome to make another bingo. I know everybody likes bingo. Yeah, humans being human, the good, the bad, and the in-between. This is a very human story. It's an incredible exploration of humanity at some of its most violent and at its worst moments. And then, as again, you can then see, for those who came to Odyssey Book Club or have read the Odyssey, you then see how the Odyssey functions as the fallout of, like, imagine Troy, but imagine the Iliad, but sustained for 10 goddamn years. A lot of the people's trauma makes a shit ton of sense.